broadcast. So.
Oh, okay.
All right. Hey, I think a few of you might be in here already waiting for us to get started. We're just getting things set up now, and we'll begin in just a minute. So last time there's a few comments that people were confused about whether we were going and what's going and so on. So I think now we are actually technically ready. You know what's fascinating here? I'm hearing myself in my ear because I have the browser window open. So I'm hearing myself in delay. This is how I want to live. I want to be able to hear all of my wisdom twice. I mean, what a blessing that would be.
We'll leave that one for you.
All right. Anyway, let's get started here. So welcome everyone for joining us. It's Sunday here in the, well, at least in the Americas. And so just want to say a quick welcome to everybody that's joining us on a Sunday afternoon. Some of you in Europe, you'll be later in the evening, and a few of you out in Australia and those parts of the world may be very early in the morning. So just want to say a quick thanks to everyone for joining. And Catherine, Stacy, how are you guys doing?
Yeah, hello. All good. I'm here. My background's a little different today from last time. I'm actually at the Fort Worth Yoga Project here in Texas. Just got through teaching class this morning, and yeah, all good here.
Great.
Hey,
Catherine, how are you doing?
I'm here in Colorado in the same spot with my new shirt that says Namaste. Namaste home with my dog.
Oh, I love it. It looks nice and fuzzy. And
yeah, how appropriate. Okay, well, you know, I'm going to dive right in. And those of you that are watching online, feel free to, I'm just going to put my face in your screen. So those of you that want to ask questions in the YouTube thing, feel free. There's a series of questions that were commented on in the actual YogaMOOC itself. So I'll start with, we'll move through a few of those, but feel free to ask any questions and we will dive in and join in. So just a few comments here saying, hey, thanks teachers for the session. Great to be here. And a few others joining in with their comments. So good to have you. So one of the first questions that came up, and I'll address this one, but it was, you know, how did you all come up with this decision to make this course into a MOOC? Yoga doesn't seem to be an obvious candidate for a MOOC, and yet I was delighted to see it in the edX offering and signed up almost immediately. Well, it's a good question in this end. So first of all, I've been going to the Yoga Project studios here in typically Arlington and Fort Worth, and that was there's a group of us from Link, spurred on by Catherine, and we started making sort of Wednesday night yoga sessions as a few of us would attend every week, and then we had in the weekends head out to Fort Worth or some of the other studios periodically. So that was just a personal practice. And I was talking to Catherine at work. So her area of research, which you're all aware of, you've seen a bit of this in the forums and in her bio and so on, but her area of research was around mindfulness and a lot of attributes to, I mean, I'll take the term we use in Link, but the aspect of being human in a digital age. And so we were chatting one day about how do you increase the impact of the kinds of initiatives that we engage in. And the idea, because I've been involved in teaching open online courses for a while, and platforms like edX and Coursera and Udacity and FutureLearn have been around for about 3 or 4 years. And so it was just an opportunity to say, how about we explore what it's like to teach something that really maybe doesn't lend itself well to being taught online? And so Catherine approached Stacy to see if Stacy was interested in being involved in preparing this kind of a course. And Stacy, we found, is ready for anything interesting. So she and Dave joined, and we had a few discussions where Stacy and Dave came down to Link Research Lab at University of Texas Arlington, spent a little bit of time with Catherine, sort of brainstorming what it might be, and the list goes on. So then we in turn arranged the video work, and the list goes on. So as you've all been aware of, the bulk of the effort here, and by bulk I mean 98% of it, has been driven by Stacy and Catherine. We've had, obviously from our end at Link, we've run some of the more technical aspects of getting the video work online and some of the forms going on and so on. I do want to make a quick point before I turn into the next question, which is around mindfulness and meditation. So we've had a bit of feedback from individuals in the course that says, absolutely love the content, the instructors, Stacy and Catherine have been outstanding. And the content is fascinating. I had somebody mention that, they're almost getting a little sad to see that the course is going to end soon. They don't have that daily dose of interesting conversations or ideas and so on. So I have to give a huge kudos or shout out to Catherine and Stacy for putting together a terrific course. Some critical feedback that we've received, and rest assured, we're learning like crazy. It's around the design of the activities, and it's around the design of the content, not the content, but the things around it. So as one person said, absolutely love the instruction, but some of the technical issues and the assignment issues and so on have been a little bit frustrating to address. So just want to be aware, let you know we are listening, and we'll make our attempts to improve things and do a better job of this going forward. So first question, we're going to talk about 4 broad categories. The first one I'm going to start with is around this idea of meditation, mindfulness, and related attributes we've talked about in the course, such as compassion. So I'm going to throw this out to you, Catherine, to get started. Are meditation and mindfulness the same concept or notion? What are the difference between meditation and mindfulness? And they said, I think mindfulness is a type of meditation, but is that correct? Over to you, Catherine.
Yeah, so this is it's a tricky distinction here. I touched on it the first week in the course, and there are a couple of lectures on this very topic, just differentiating mindfulness or explaining mindfulness and how it's one type of meditation, like the individual said. So just to go into more detail on it, there's this idea of meditation, and there are thousands of types of meditation. And what we really talk about in the course, what I've mentioned, is that it's a type of mental training. And with mindfulness, there's this idea that we are really bringing our attention to sort of a single object, at least initially. And the idea behind that is to actually train the mind to be calm. Because naturally, as you know, if we just were to just sit there and relax, what our brains do automatically is to daydream. So we know that if you just tell someone to just sit there and relax, you will see this area of the brain that's called the default mode network. And that is just completely online when you're just sitting and relaxing, and because you're daydreaming. And you know that you go one thought leads to the next thought, to the next thought, and so on. And that's just this is a natural way of being. The idea with meditation and how we start our mindfulness meditation is to train the mind to focus on one single object. And with the mindfulness practice, it's typically the breath. And the reason that we choose the breath is because it's portable, it's free, and every single person has it. So we can train our minds to cultivate our attention on that single object. Now, that's sort of the beginning stages. In a Buddhist tradition, that we're not teaching that in the course, but a lot of mindfulness as we know it today, especially in the US, is from that tradition, especially mindfulness-based stress reduction. We know we learned from a Buddhist tradition. But so with mindfulness, we are paying attention, we're calming. We can call it calm abiding. So basically, you're calming the mind, and then your attention is sort of abiding to that one object. So for example, the breath. And then ultimately, the idea then is that you can gain insight into sort of the nature of your mind. But you can't do that if you have no control of it. So the idea is to train attention over and over so that we have control of our mind. We're doing that mental training, that meditative practice, and then we can sort of gain insight into the nature of our minds. And that can happen. That really happens with a formal meditation by sitting, shutting down our eyes, lowering our gaze at least, and just really tuning into our minds and bodies. Now, that's sort of a formal practice, but you can, in an informal sense, practice mindfulness, you know, throughout your days. And the idea behind that is just to have full present moment awareness in whatever you're doing. So, for example, in the last session, I said that I try to practice mindfulness when I'm on hikes. So I just try to be fully there, letting every moment come, being fully present, letting it happen, and then letting it go. So long story short, mindfulness is a type of meditation. It's also something that we can practice informally. And this is not the only type of meditation. So there's one that we practice in the course, loving kindness meditation, or compassion meditation. So that's a different type of mental training by focusing on others, for example. And then there are many other types of meditation. So long story short, mindfulness is a type of meditation, and then there are other types of meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Stacy, from your end, I know you do some training sessions with individuals at your studio, and so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see mindfulness, meditation, or mindfulness and meditation in terms of your experience as an instructor in this area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I love that, Catherine, the way she described it as, for instance, the breath would be a starting point. And then there's this, I really, when I work with people here at the studio in our meditation classes and such, we really try to expand upon this understanding that it is a starting point, because what typically happens the moment that we say, okay, now we're going to sit for 5 minutes and we're going to pay attention to our breath, it brings about what Catherine referred to as this, what did you say? You said it brings insight, I think you said. But we start to understand ourselves more, because if we're paying attention to our breath, very quickly what happens when we give ourselves an assignment like that is other things start to arise. We start to notice the tendency of our mind. We start to notice maybe a busy sort of thinking at times that we wouldn't have been aware of otherwise. So I love that idea of the breath, or whatever object of focus that we choose, as being the starting point, because the nature of that practice is that other things arise just within that assignment that we give ourselves. And that's really, in my opinion, the beauty of it, because it really helps us to establish a seat where we can start to self-observe and self-understand from that place. And also to understand that the same part of us that is aware of our breath isn't the same part of us that is aware of our thinking mind too. And I think that's so vital. And I know Catherine has talked about this when she has described the mindfulness practice, but that the same part of you that's watching the breath is the same part of you that's watching thoughts. And so it's still awareness even when you are noticing thoughts. And I know a lot of people think that that's a failure. Oh, I'm seeing myself thinking, this isn't working. But yeah, I don't want to ramble too much on that, but yeah.
I just wanted to add too, because you raised this point of, it's like the breath becomes our point of reference, or it doesn't have to be the breath. You know, it's just typically what we use. It could be a sound, or it could be a body part, but it's our point of reference. And so when the mind wanders, because it inevitably will, this is sort of the hang up that people get on, is like, oh, I can't do it because my mind is just going crazy. And that is the whole practice. The whole practice is noticing that your mind will naturally wander, and then bring it back to that point of reference, at least at first. That's the mental training. That's the entire practice, is letting, trying to pay attention to one single object. The mind goes, and then bringing it back. And that's the practice every single time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to think of, as others have said, it's a simple thing that's very hard to do, which leads us into the next question relating to mindfulness, which one of the comments in the forum was, are there examples of our everyday mindfulness activities that individuals can engage in? So you can do them while you're at work, you can do them when you're talking with friends, you can do them alone. So basically it's a question that relates to everyday examples of mindfulness practices. And let's start with you, Stacey. I mean, how do you spend your time being mindful throughout the day? And how have you heard or seen others do the same activities?
Well, I find myself right now doing it with you, and just as when we're with others and listening to other, and I think this relates back, Catherine. Did we already do the deep listening exercise? It falls into this idea of, our natural tendency when we're in conversation can be our mind jumping ahead to what we're going to say next.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in. That's in week 6. So
okay,
we do
okay.
that exercise.
Okay, well, that's to come. But just right, an example would be, I practice this often when I remember to, but when I'm in conversation with someone, just, taking deep breaths and getting myself calm to actually be open and available to listen to the words that are being spoken to me, and noticing myself when I'm jumping ahead in my mind in conversation, and just preparing when I, think about that or what I want to say or put my 2 cents in. And so that's a huge one if you're around people, is to just be in this practice of listening. And then one that I think of, because I commute a lot, and so I'm on the road a lot, and you always hear, don't meditate while you're driving. And, maybe in certain ways don't meditate while you're driving, but I find driving to be a very potent practice of paying attention to how I'm responding. And, for instance, turning off the radio, turning off all of the noise that's coming at me, and just feeling the steering wheel, feeling the road beneath the wheels of the car, noticing the other cars around me, noticing my own body and mental response to other people's driving habits around me and things like that. And gosh, that is a really eye-opening practice. And I often think, if I find myself getting testy or frustrated with people around me, I think, oh, that could be my son, or that could be my mother, or, even how I would want to be treated. So gosh, the practices are everywhere in everything that we're doing all day long.
Mm-hmm. And you gave an example of how to practice in the course, right, Stacey, with your phone?
Yes.
So every time you touch your phone, be mindful. And so I would just reiterate and say, it's at every single moment you have an opportunity to practice mindfulness, which is full attention to the present moment, full awareness of the present moment in a non-judgmental way. That's the typical definition. And so, I would just say there's, in addition to mindful listening, which is a great practice, and we do give a specific practice in the course in week 6 for that. But there's, mindful eating. That's a good one. I think that's the toughest one for me. I really love food, but some people think it's great to, have conversation and stuff and eat. And that is, that's a fun practice to do. But if you're having lunch, maybe one day a week or a couple of days a week, choose to be fully there by yourself in silence with your food. Eat slowly and mindfully. So being very aware of every bite of food, the feel of your food. Think about where your food came from, the taste of it, and so on, and just be fully there with mindful eating. That's, I really enjoy that practice. So you could do that, anytime you're eating. So I think that's just one additional practice. But again, you can be mindful, especially on walks. That's a great time to just notice, the ground underneath your feet, how it feels, and so on. So.
And I just want to add quickly to what Catherine's saying is that, something that I'm thinking of as you're saying this that works for me is allowing a sense of easiness and joyfulness to arise within those activities, because I know I can be really type A, and so I can be outside and I'm focusing, I'm working hard, I'm feeling this footstep, I'm feeling my breath, or I'm listening to every word Catherine's saying. But something really shifted for me when I realized, like a state of presence and mindfulness can be easy and joyful. And so just in case that resonates with any of you, like it doesn't always have to be this hard, forcing, trying, rigid practice.
Yeah, totally. I would just agree and say the thing that I practice is when I am, cultivating that attention to one single thing or trying to be fully there. If I notice, oh, I'm thinking about this project that I want to do in 3 weeks, and then instead of being like, oh, you're not being mindful, just, be compassionate. That's the moment to bring in compassion and a little bit, of appreciation and joy into it, which can be, bring in this lightheartedness. And that's one thing that you said to me, Stacy. I think I said this in the last session, but don't take yourself too seriously. Mm-hmm. Don't take your mindfulness practice too seriously. Be joyful, have fun.
And I know we're talking a lot about this, but I have to add one more thing. So we have to remember that we're talking about all of these practices of mindfulness. Like we practice yoga, we practice feeling our hands and our breath, we sit and we do mindfulness meditation. But we can't forget that our life can be filled with natural moments of presence. So doing things that we enjoy and love and, things that make us happy and being with our pets or the sunrise or the sunset or outdoors, all of these things are natural states of presence that we don't have to be in this structured, rigid practice to, receive the benefits from. So just keep that in mind. That's something I'm telling myself that, and that's something I'm always practicing is remember that there's lots of natural opportunities for natural presence that we don't always have to be in some structured, now I'm going to practice mindfulness.
Great. Thanks for your reflections on that. And I'll speak for myself as well, because I can be an exceptionally disjointed person and randomly distracted quite easily. Definitely shiny pennies are amusing. But I've found quite a bit of success in, I think we were talking about taming the monkey in the course, I believe it was, in a section, monkey mind is, I've found using apps can be quite useful, whether it's something like Insight Timer or any apps around mindful meditation. I have a walking meditation app that I'll use. And if I'm particularly just, all over the place that day, that's quite useful to help me center my thinking. On the other hand, if I'm feeling a little more centered as it is and more aware and less distracted by a lot of things, then I don't need the apps. I sometimes find, apps and technologies can be a bit of a crutch and a helpful way, not in a negative way, to begin integrating some of those practices in a little more structured way. Mm-hmm. Let me turn into the next set of questions related to mindfulness, which is, what about kids? And how do we, are there exercises that you would recommend that we can start using to begin practicing mindfulness with children, or how do you teach it to kids?
So the best advice I can give, just coming from my developmental psychology background, is to model it. That the surest way to for the practice not to be beneficial for a child is for you to try to teach them and control them in a way through the practices without practicing it yourself. So I think that the best way for a child to learn mindfulness is to see the adults in their lives being mindful and practicing mindfulness. That being said, there are specific techniques that have been developed for children, yoga being one. So doing, teaching them poses and linking that with breath. There are entire programs around that are being implemented in schools. I would recommend, if you are interested in specific exercises, there is a woman, Susan Kaiser Greenland. We can put that in the forum somewhere. I'm not sure, George, how we want to do that, but I can give that name. So it's Susan Kaiser Greenland, and she wrote a book called Mindful Games. And it is a great text because it groups children by developmental period. So you have the youngest, kiddos, toddlers, childhood, later childhood, adolescence, and specific practices that you can do with children. And I think that she's onto something with the mindful games, because kids really do need things that are concrete. You cannot set them down and say, okay, just just focus on your breathing. That might happen for 2 or 3 breaths, but they're gone. They just don't have the attention span. So making things concrete. So for example, with younger kids, I know a great practice is to take maybe a stuffed animal or something and place it on their belly and just say, notice when you take deep breaths and, your belly rises and falls, you can notice that stuffed animal, rising and falling. So they can actually visualize it and see it. And so they're like tuning into their breath that way. There are many, many other examples of these concrete things. For example, a glitter ball, basically a snow globe that a child could create. And when you shake it up, you tell them, these are your thoughts, this is your mind, this is your glitter is just kind of going crazy. And then the idea is to settle your glitter. That's a term that has been used. And the idea is, settle your mind. So they can actually, they shake it up, and then they can watch the glitters sort of just fall to the bottom. And that's, settling your mind, settling your glitter. So those are 2 examples, but I'll say the topic is, there's a vast literature and there are plenty of resources out there. So the mindful games is a good text read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Stacy, any thoughts or reflections on that?
I was just thinking of the one, like your bowl of soup. Have you heard that one, Catherine? Like smell your bowl of soup. Like
no.
You have a big bowl of soup and you pause for a few moments and you smell your bowl of soup. Like that's sort of like the glitter, I guess. But I just, I think of it. I think there are all of these things that we can give kids tools for self-regulation and being able to pause in the moment and things like that when their emotions are rising. But I also think that a little bit in reverse, in that kids are so much, depending on the child and the circumstance they're in, they're so naturally present. And I feel like little kids are so naturally into the details of, they're outside and they're wanting to put their face in the leaves and the rocks and the dirt. And I think that's such a natural state of children. And so as adults, like Catherine said, instead of us saying, now I'm going to teach you something, I think that we have a lot to learn from them. And if we honor and really recognize that beautiful state of presence within them and go with them on that journey, and kind of, I don't know, really helping them recognize that state that they're in, I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do as well, along with these other structured exercises and practices to help, finding the breath in the moment and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and giving them those tools that they can go back to when they are in a heightened state of emotional reactivity. That is the worst time to try to talk to your child. It will never work. I mean, imagine it for yourself. If you're in a really just, this heightened emotional state of anger or whatever it is, you're not rational. No, you can't, you're not going to have a rational conversation at that point. You have to calm down. And it's even more true for children. Mm-hmm. So, don't try to say, okay, now we're going to do this. Since you're in that state, just sort of let them calm down and relax before you try to teach them anything at that point. Mm-hmm.
And just a quick note, I was unable to put the URL into the forum for the Susan Kaiser Greenland link that Catherine mentioned. But if you Google her name, Susan Kaiser, Kaiser Greenland, you'll be able to get just access to her site. And she has, tips and FAQs and so on. There's another organization that some of you may have heard already, but it's called Mind Up, which is, I think Goldie Hawn actually initiated this. And a fair number of schools are using this type of, approach in their classroom, or trying to promote mindfulness in their classroom interactions. And so I think spend a little bit of time looking from the children, and there's certainly an abundance of resources that are out there already.
Yeah, can I just say one more thing with that?
Of course.
Which is just to reiterate my first point from this is me with the research hat on, that we're finding the programs aren't as beneficial as we thought that they would be. And what really seems to be happening is that we aren't teaching the teachers. We're not giving them the mindfulness first. So that's just to reiterate my point that the adults have to embody it. You can't just go in and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is the practice. Now you'll be calm and mindful. That's just not how it works. It has to sort of be embodied and a lived experience that the adults have to then impart on the child.
All right. Well, we're going to thank you for that clarification. Yeah, definitely mentoring and modeling any kind of behavior, and ways of being or mindsets is certainly much more effective, especially with kids, rather than saying, this is what thou shalt do. But let's look at the final question around the mindfulness discussion. And this one in particular is a type of mindfulness practice, and you mentioned this earlier, Catherine, but it's the idea of compassion. And the comment that individual provided here is it's harder to be compassionate toward myself than with others. It's been a certain kind of stress, so that comes out as a result of trying that. So the question or the point comes in, please describe how you would use yoga to improve the ability to be compassionate with oneself. I would appreciate some words on the scientific, physiological, and psychological consequences of compassion if it's not practiced toward oneself. Two questions here. Let's take them in individual parts. The first one is, what's the relationship, or how would you use yoga to improve compassionate toward oneself?
So if we're talking about yoga in the sense of a physical practice with poses, an easy one is to just bring self-kindness to yourself when you're going through difficult postures, or if things just aren't feeling right, to cultivate self-kindness. I will say the way that self-compassion is defined by Kristen Neff, which that is sort of the construct that I'm familiar with from a psychological research in. And she defines it, as you read this week, and she has an interview this week that I recommend viewing, is mindfulness is one of 3 components. So we've talked extensively about mindfulness. So you can see right there, you can bring in that aspect of self-compassion to your yoga practice. Self-kindness, which is what I just mentioned, which is self-explanatory, being kind to yourself, having warm thoughts, talking to yourself in a kind way, talking to yourself like you would talk to a friend. And then common humanity. So recognizing that other people, that your experience is not unique. We like to think, I'm having this and I'm different than everyone and this is a problem. Versus recognizing, this is part of being human. Every human has these experiences. They have the same struggles. I'm not alone in those experiences. So, as far as concrete examples with yoga, I mean, we talked about mindfulness, talking to yourself kindly. And then when you're on the mat, recognizing that other people have had those struggles as well.
Stacy, from your end, is there anything that you would say from the experience? Because I would imagine, and at least if my experience is similar to what others that have come into your studios have encountered, but it's, you come in the first time, and don't get me wrong, I really do rock a pair of Lululemon leggings. However, some people may feel a little uncomfortable first time you're walking in, and you've got, the body types, what I've found most enjoyable really is it's, you have everyone from, I've seen 5-6-year-old kids in your studio, Stacy, up to people who are, 70 plus. So these individuals obviously come in with a different mindset. My first yoga session was mildly terrifying because everyone else looked like they knew what they were doing. Somebody would say this and others would do that, and I'm trying to mirror or model the people that are around me. So I think from a body image perspective, from a personal confidence perspective, I can understand why individuals might walk into a yoga studio feeling a little hesitant about engaging and also feeling self-critical once they're there and they start to see other people doing what to them might feel like they're managing it perfectly. But how do you comment on someone who has some compassion issues in the practice of yoga?
Yeah, it's so true. I think that self-compassion arises in big part from this practice of self-observation and self-understanding. And I think that, I think I've mentioned this in the course somewhere along the way, but the students that I see that have the most, and I say this with quotes, but quote unquote success in the practice are the ones who can meet themselves right where they're at. I mean, I know we've had a lot of this arise in the course, people saying they can't do the flow part, or they can't do the down dog, or they can't do different elements of the practice, but just this ability to meet yourself right where you're at really stems from having self-compassion and displaying self-kindness, and not, noticing. And it's challenging because it's kind of this common human thing, but we're always judging ourselves and trying to, feel enough in whether it's in a yoga class or in our lives. And just this practice of showing up and meeting yourself exactly where you are at, whatever pants you're wearing, George. And, just whatever state your body is in, it doesn't matter if you can only, I think that I heard someone recently say, if you can move your leg 1 inch and you can breathe, you can do yoga. And I even thought, well, I don't even know if you have to be able to move your leg 1 inch to be able to do yoga. I mean, if you could just sit and if you can breathe, you can do yoga. And so it's really just about this practice of meeting yourself where you are at physically, mentally. Even if you come in and you have monkey mind and that stays for years, that's okay too. So I think it really just boils down to that. And this practice that this part that's central to what we do in yoga practice is this concrete breath and body sensation. It goes back to how Catherine was describing mindfulness earlier as this entry point. There's this entry point of paying attention to your body and your breath, and then other things arise within our awareness from there. And a big part of mindful awareness is this piece of without judgment, and that's just such a lifelong practice for all of us.
Well, let's flow into thanks for that again. Let's flow into the second part of that question. And this is something I think, Catherine, I'm not sure your familiarity with anything on this directly, but it's this idea of what if you're not compassionate to yourself? Like, what if you're just downright mean? Is there any scientific, psychophysiological evidence that suggests that that's a bad thing? Like, what's the impact of that?
So there's a really healthy amount of research on this, largely out of Dr. Kristen Neff's lab, but that's extended to many researchers, psychologists across the world who have been researching this topic. And if you are really specifically interested in reading more scientific papers on self-compassion, I would direct you to her website, which I believe we linked to in the course. If not, perhaps, George, you can drop a link into the YouTube forum, but she has a list of all of her papers there. And just as a very brief synopsis, we know that by practicing self-compassion, the individuals they're more effective with coping with setbacks. So, for example, in divorce, people that are more self-compassionate, that use more self-compassionate language, they're adapting better to that setback, and they're more effective in coping with that. Also in chronic pain, they're more individuals who practice self-compassion are more effective in coping with that pain. We know from military research that you're less likely to develop PTSD after combat trauma by practicing self-compassion. We also know that self-compassion is linked to greater motivation, which is initially, it's sort of counterintuitive because especially from a gendered end, you associate this sort of self-compassion with being more feminine or fluffy. If you're taking a very stereotypical angle, I'm a man, I'm not going to be, compassionate towards myself, but we find actually it's just quite the opposite. If you're more self-compassionate, you tend to be more motivated. It's linked to more intrinsic motivation and less fear of failure. You're more likely to persist after a setback if you are more self-compassionate to yourself. It's also linked to healthier behavior. So it's been shown that self-compassion can help smokers quit. People that are more self-compassionate use less alcohol. They're exercising more. So it is linked to a host of health benefits as well. From a physiological end, there's much less research on that end, but I'm familiar with a few studies that have studied self-compassion in terms of response to stress. And we know that if individuals are randomly assigned to practice self-compassion or not, and then they experience a stressful situation, there's less of a physiological reaction to the stressful situation for those that have practiced self-compassion. So there's even more research than what I just spewed off there, but it's a good area of research, and it overall tends to suggest that if we're more self-compassionate, we have healthier outcomes.
Great, thanks for that comprehensive response there. I think what I'd like to do now, we've sort of integrated mindfulness and compassion and meditation and some of the yoga discussions already, but let's turn specifically some of the questions that were related, that came up in the forum around yoga and yoga practices. So there's a couple of different questions in here. So this one relates more so, I believe, to the idea of when I jump from down dog with an inhale breath versus jumping empty. So I guess the question is a little bit, confused, or that this feeling is a bit of a sense of confusion. It says, I definitely feel the sensation when I jump empty. Are both benefiting my body the same way? And what is the difference between both ways for your practice? Stacy?
Yeah, so as far as benefiting your body the same way, I mean, I can't really have a scientific answer for that. I don't know. But I will say, as far as just the mechanics of movement and vinyasa yoga and flow and breath and how we practice it, is that if you think of the movement from down dog to jumping or stepping to the top of the mat, there's an aim to have a lightness there. And so when we exhale and we get rid of all of our breath, there's the ability for the diaphragm to lift up and for there to be a nice engagement in the abdomen, which creates a bigger sense of lightness for most people. So that jump or step forward to the top of the mat would be in a lighter state on an empty breath. And then the second piece of that, why it makes sense biomechanically with the breath, is that when you get to the front of the mat in this sort of flow practice that you're referring to, there's the halfway lift move comes next. So the halfway lift, as soon as your feet touch the top of the mat, you're drawing your spine long. And anytime in this sort of flow practice, when we're aligning breath with movement, we typically correlate an elongation or an expansion with an in-breath. Breathing out while, it makes more sense to be empty when I get there so that I'm ready for a big breath in for halfway lift. And then there's, the reason we're syncing breath with movement is that, we're hoping to breathe in a way that it actually makes the movement a little easier. It actually makes sense in our bodies with the momentum of our movement. And the more we can get into the concreteness of that synchronicity between breath and body, hopefully the bigger state of mindful awareness we can also be in the practice.
And I think the next question that quite literally flows from that is, first of all, there was a few comments saying, yay, Stacy and Catherine, for a comprehensive jam-packed course with tools that can help people improve their wellness and quality of life. And this individual is thankful for your hard work and truly grateful for instruction, guidance, and encouragement. So thanks for sharing those thoughts. And certainly I've seen how much effort and time Catherine and Stacy have put into this. So those words are very well warranted. The specific question that arises, though, is what are the benefits of flow yoga versus doing the asanas individually? And would younger people benefit more from the former than an older population, say over 70? Mm-hmm. Either of you have a thought on that?
I would say it could go either way. I mean, we have people in our studios that are, 70s, early 70s doing a flow practice, and they have been doing it for several years now, and the practice really fits for them. But I do see that in some people's just lifestyle and physical ability, if the agility is not there and there's difficulty getting up and down off the floor, where it becomes frustrating to attempt to link breath with movement, then holding postures is also, it can be very beneficial as well. We have people that come into the studio who they're joining into our flow classes, but it works better for them to be more still and to not do all of the vinyasa. And so we just teach them how to modify that. And we'll always have a small percentage of students in class who are just holding the postures and then meeting us for the vinyasa, or not doing the vinyasa in between. And I really think you have to do what you just feel works for you. I think there's something to not always gravitating towards what's necessarily just easiest for you, because there's that, sparking our system for growth, and, doing something that's challenging can be really healthy for us as well. So sorry, that's not a really exact answer, but I just think it always comes back to, how it feels for you, and either can be very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, from the scientific research, and there's no research directly comparing different types of yoga practices, especially in different populations, and looking at various outcomes. We're just not there yet. Maybe in a decade, there will be research around that very topic. But I would just reiterate that it's your own experience, and try different types. I'm, just now in my personal practice, getting to where I like hold down dog for 10 minutes. And can be just as challenging, as a flow class, or, I think the intention is probably that it's supposed to promote sort of rest and relaxation. But, holding postures for an extended period of time can be really great. So this is just to say, try different types. I think we said that from the very beginning, that we and Stacy is instructing on a particular type of yoga, more or less, and that there are many other forms out there, and you should be curious and open to practicing those different ways of yoga.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say I love both. I love flow. I love holding postures. And I find that I benefit differently from them on different days too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then another question, it's a revisit to what we had earlier around introducing children to yoga, and certainly interesting to see this idea of a whole family practice. I know at the Arlington studio, this was probably about 4 months ago, there's this lady that came in, and she set up her mat with her little, I think, 5-year-old son, and he stood in the back, and he was there for the duration of the class. And I thought, well, that's terrific. I mean, what a delightful way to, using Catherine's statement earlier, but to model the kinds of practices that are going to be healthy for children to develop for themselves in the long run. So yoga as a family, mindfulness as a family, seems to be one of the, a really special opportunity to connect with your children or people that you care about. Do either of you know of resources? In this case, the question is, are there videos, resources, or so on that you would direct people to help them bring their children into the practice of yoga as well?
I don't have any resources prepared. I wish I did, but what I could do is look and share later. We do a lot of kids yoga, or not a lot, periodically. Every few weeks we have kids programs at our studio. And outside of knowing resources, I will say that kids love just, making it some sort of play. We do a lot of things. We have a teacher who she'll bring in some sort of story, and the kids will work for 3 weeks creating a sort of recital with a story and their bodies and yoga poses, so that by the end of the program, the parents come in and watch the recital, and they're telling a story with their yoga poses, and they absolutely love that. So really anything to make it fun, and knowing that, keeping in mind that depending on the child's age and depending on the child, their attention span is just not the same as an adult. And so just knowing that it has to be a little different than,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the part that you said about creating is just so important, to give children that space to be creative and explore. You never want to say, oh no, this is how you do it. You're doing down dog and this is high plank and these are the poses. It's giving them a bit of freedom to be exploratory, and to teach is really fun too. Come up with things, what animal does this pose look like? And, you could name it, give it a name, and then do fun things like that. One of my best friends is a teacher, and she does breathing exercises with her kiddos. They're third graders. She might do some yoga poses in there, but she has this one child that really loves the breath and loves coming up with creative ways to do breathing. So she sent me a video of him doing, it was a volcano breath, and it was, breathing in and then expanding and exhaling. And it was just, it was super creative to watch him do that and then teach the class. That could be really fun too. So just have fun with it.
Mm-hmm. And not feeling like you have to follow any particular anything. Like, yeah.
All right, so the question that came in the forums on YouTube, I'm not going to answer, but I just want to acknowledge it briefly. And the reason I'm not going to answer is because I don't know. But basically the question is there evidence that online yoga or mindfulness meditation interventions have a positive impact, on the individuals or even on the medium in general? Online learning has a pretty long history now. It's gone back 20 some years, and certainly accelerating right now in the US. We're sitting around 50% of the student population at a traditional university will take an online course. 42% of faculty will end up teaching an online course or have at least taught an online course. And even where they aren't teaching them yet, there's a lot of blended instruction, meaning you're adding a lot of technology into the classroom. So certainly whether the effectiveness of it is secondary in this case, it's just a trend of more and more of the instruction and the interactions that we're engaged in happen online. The other aspect to think about is here we've got, I think, just over 19,000 students that have enrolled in this particular course. We have various levels of participation from those. The opportunity here, as I remember hearing the person who eventually ended up becoming the CEO of edX, the platform on which we're running this course, he said after he ran his first MOOC, and he had several 100,000 students join. At that point, there weren't a lot of options, so every course got ridiculous numbers. And he said that in that course, he had taught 10 times as many people as he had taught in his entire 30-year career at MIT in one course. And I think that's an interesting aspect with this medium, is that there is a different scale that's at play. Regarding your question of effectiveness, that's a good question. Practices like yoga or things that are more kinesthetic, those are likely more varying outcomes compared to, let's say, something, reading and discussing literature, for example, that lends itself a bit more quickly to the online environment. Short answer is, I don't know the answer to your question, but it's definitely something that the Happiness MOOC that was run on edX as well is another example. There's nutrition MOOCs that I've seen come up over the last little while, which addresses another question that has come up in the forum a few times and was asked in this as well. I'd certainly encourage you to look at those MOOCs if you're looking at from an instructional end. So essentially, if it can be taught in person, at least parts of it can be taught online. And there's questions around what's effective. It's often a matter of what's the reach and the audience that you can access as much as in terms of its general effectiveness. I'm going to turn now to a question that came relating stress, and this is going to be directed to you, Catherine, because I know you've spent some time thinking about stress and stress effects and so on. And maybe you could, and this is something that you did address in your videos as well, but maybe you can just give us a quick overview. I mean, there's good and there's bad stress. Like, not all stress is negative. We seem to have this view that stress is a bad thing all around. And as Stacy mentioned earlier in one of her answers, is sometimes we have to push ourselves. We have to move out of our comfort zone to get results that we perhaps haven't had in the past. So you can talk a little bit about good stress, bad stress?
Mm-hmm. So every day we have stress, we have acute stress, and there's a reason for that. And it's the same stress response that our ancestors had when they, you know, many years ago, when they encountered something in the wild. Their body had a physiological reaction to that experience, and we have the same thing happens to us now. The biggest difference in what we talked about in the course this week is that keeping it acute, you know, having an experience, recognizing that it's there to make us better, to hone our attention for sort of optimal performance. That's why we have it. You can appreciate it for that, from that angle. And but keeping it there, not letting stress take over, hijack your body and brain, and becoming chronic. I think that's the biggest difference. And what we talked a lot about this week is your perception of it. So like I said, and that's not to say, oh, just go around with sort of rose-colored glasses on and think positively about everything. It's just more so recognizing for stress for what it is. You know, recognizing the physiological response that you have when you have a stressful situation, and then engaging in certain practices, whether it's a mindset, if breathing is what you need in that moment to sort of bring your physiology down to baseline, then do that, to sort of get back to where you were. Don't let it sort of, like I said, hijack your entire being to where you don't have control. And I think it's, you know, it's a good practice to recognize that stress, that we do have it for a reason, that it does help us, you know, pay attention and so on. Many other positive benefits to it. So just, you can, you know, have this appreciation for it, and then appreciate that you can recognize it and sort of have these practices in your back pocket to get to a place of regulation and calmness.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Stacy, we've got about a couple minutes left here, so I'm going to throw the last question your way. This is something I found interesting, Lisa, because you know, every yoga session I've ever been to fits the question that's being asked here, which is, do you always teach standing and instructing? Or do you ever partly or fully do the class with your attendees? I see the value of being able to be alert at all times to what the participants are doing, but I also find it beneficial for them to visually see us doing the poses, or in a strong flow class, to be with the group doing it. That creates a type of energy. Any reaction to that or comments?
Yeah, that's a really big question that's central to our teacher training and how our philosophy around working with teachers that are going to be with students in the classroom. And, you know, it comes back to relevancy and being able to really connect with and see the students that are in front of you. And, you know, for the most part, we train teachers to, you know, not be doing the practice and to be walking around, and so they can actually be able to be helpful in the moment. We find that if a teacher has a way of teaching where it's strictly put my mat down, I'm doing the practice, it can be challenging to not get lost within your own practice and to not be able to see those in front of you and to be helpful. Not that at times it will be relevant to need to demo some things. So depending on what you're teaching, I know recently I was teaching a different sort of class format. This week, actually, I was teaching a slow flow format where we were doing things a little differently than we normally do it. So the students weren't accustomed to what I was teaching. So I was demoing more than I normally do, but it was relevant and it was needed and it was helpful. Yeah, so it really comes down to that. I mostly walk around and help. I attempt to put, if I have for instance, this morning we taught a class here, we had about 40 people and we had a few new people. And so we really pay attention to where we place the new people so that they can be most successful. We place them where they can see people in front of them, beside them, and behind them so that they can have that to help them. But it can be both. But I just say, as a teacher, you have to consider where can you be most mindful of what's in front of you, and how can you be most helpful.
All right, great. Thanks very much. And I think that sort of concludes our discussion here. So before we wrap up officially, any last words or comments, Catherine, Stacy?
Just thank you all for tuning in, and thanks for being here. And we're learning a lot from you, and we hope you're benefiting as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I know that there's a good amount of participation in the forums, but I know there's a lot of you that are participating and watching that aren't in the forums as well. So know that we know that, and we realize that, and we really appreciate all of your contribution. And yeah, thanks, and I'll look forward to the next week.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Stacy. Hope everybody has a great day. And for those Americans in our midst, have an awesome Thanksgiving as well.
Bye.